There are moments in a courtroom when everything appears routine, predictable, almost mechanical, and then something shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that changes the entire direction of a case, and sometimes a life. I've seen thousands of hearings. I've watched people lie, deflect, break down, and occasionally tell the truth too late. But this one didn't begin with truth. It began with a quiet woman standing alone, accused of something that, on paper, looked simple. But nothing about it was simple. She was 72 years old, small frame, frail hands, a gray shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, as if she were trying to hold herself together. She didn't look like someone who belonged in a criminal courtroom. And yet, there she was, standing before a judge, facing the possibility of jail. Her name was Margaret Ellison, and according to the official report, she had committed fraud. The prosecutor didn't hesitate. He spoke clearly, confidently, as if this case had already been decided. Your Honor, the defendant knowingly and repeatedly withdrew funds from a closed account belonging to a deceased individual. The total amount exceeds several $1,000s. This is not a misunderstanding. This is deliberate. There was a pause after that. Not for effect, but because, in most cases, that would be enough. Fraud, repeated withdrawals, deceased account holder. It sounded cold, calculated, criminal. Margaret didn't react. She didn't argue. She didn't even look up. She just stood there, hands clasped, eyes lowered. The judge, an older man with decades of experience, studied her carefully. Not just her appearance, but her stillness. There was something about it. Not defiance, not indifference. Something else. Something heavy. Mrs. Ellison, the judge said calmly, do you understand the charges against you? She nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor. Her voice was soft, but steady. Do you wish to respond? Another pause, and for a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't say anything at all. Then quietly, I didn't mean to do anything wrong. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't even an explanation. Just a sentence. Simple, almost fragile. The prosecutor stepped forward again, already prepared. Intent can be inferred from repeated action, Your Honor. The account had been closed for over 6 months. Notifications were sent. Transactions continued. He wasn't wrong. Legally, the case was clean. Clear evidence, clear pattern. But something didn't sit right. The judge leaned back slightly, his eyes still on Margaret. Mrs. Ellison, he said, more gently this time. Whose account was it? For the first time, she hesitated. Her fingers tightened slightly around each other. It was my son's. That changed the air in the room, not dramatically, not visibly, but you could feel it. The prosecutor continued, but his tone shifted just a fraction. The account belonged to her son, Daniel Ellison, who passed away last year. However, that does not grant authorization to continue withdrawals after the account's closure. Again, legally correct. But now, there was context. And context has a way of complicating things. The judge nodded slowly. Mrs. Ellison, he said, why were you withdrawing money from your son's account? This time the silence stretched longer, long enough that the courtroom began to feel uncomfortable. She swallowed, looked down, and when she spoke again, her voice was thinner. I thought it was still mine to use. The prosecutor was quick to respond. That belief is not supported by any legal documentation, Your Honor. The account was not jointly held. She was not listed as a beneficiary. Margaret didn't argue. She didn't even look at him. Because whatever she was thinking, it wasn't about the law. It was about something else entirely. The judge tapped his pen lightly against the desk, a small, almost absent gesture. But those who knew him understood. It meant he was thinking deeper than what was being presented. Mrs. Ellison, he said, did you receive the notices about the account being closed? A slight nod. Yes. And you continued to withdraw funds after that? Another nod. Yes. From a legal standpoint, that was it. Admission, confirmation. The case should have moved forward quickly from there, but it didn't, because the judge didn't move on. Instead, he asked something no one expected. Why? It was a simple question, but it wasn't legal. It wasn't procedural. It was human. Margaret's lips trembled slightly, not enough to be dramatic, just enough to show that something inside her was beginning to crack. I didn't know what else to do. That was the first time the room shifted completely, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. There was no manipulation in her voice, no attempt to gain sympathy, just exhaustion. The kind that doesn't come from a single bad decision, but from a long chain of them. The prosecutor remained composed, but even he hesitated before speaking again. Your Honor, financial hardship does not justify fraud. Many individuals face difficult circumstances without resorting to illegal actions. Again, true. But truth, in a courtroom, isn't always just about facts. It's about understanding. And the judge knew that. He leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Ellison, he said, I'm going to ask you to explain. Fully. She looked up then, just briefly, and in that moment, you could see something that hadn't been visible before. Fear, not of punishment, but of not being believed. My son, Daniel, she began, her voice unsteady now. He was sick for a long time. The courtroom grew quiet. No shuffling, no whispering, just silence. He had a condition they couldn't fix. It got worse every year. By the end, he couldn't work anymore. She paused, gathering herself. I took care of him. Everything. The hospital visits, the medications, the nights when he couldn't sleep. This wasn't part of the legal record. None of this had been mentioned in the report. Because reports don't capture lives. They capture actions. He had that account, she continued. It was where his disability payments went. When he passed, I didn't think about the account. I just kept going. Her voice cracked slightly on that last sentence. Kept going. As if life didn't stop. As if grief didn't give her time to process anything. I used the money for the house, for the bills, for his medical debts that were still coming in. I thought it was still okay. The prosecutor shifted slightly, not uncomfortably, but thoughtfully, because this wasn't the story he had prepared for. The judge remained still, watching, listening. Mrs. Ellison, he said carefully, the notices you received, did you understand them? She shook her head slowly. I read them, but I didn't really understand what they meant. Everything was happening so fast. After he passed, I was alone. I didn't have anyone to explain things. There it was. Not ignorance, not defiance, isolation, a different kind of vulnerability. The prosecutor spoke again, but this time, there was less edge in his voice. Your Honor, regardless of her personal circumstances, the financial institution clearly communicated the account's status. Continued withdrawals resulted in measurable loss. He wasn't wrong. But now, it felt incomplete, because the story had expanded beyond the charges. The judge nodded slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He asked for the account statements, not just the withdrawals, everything. They were brought forward, pages of transactions, dates, amounts, details. At first glance, it looked exactly like the prosecution had described, repeated withdrawals over several months. But the judge didn't stop at the surface. He looked closer, and then he noticed something. Counsel, he said, glancing up. These withdrawals, they're consistent. The prosecutor nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Regular transactions. The judge tilted his head slightly. Regular and modest. There was a brief pause, because that wasn't how fraud cases usually looked. They're not large amounts, the judge continued. They're just enough to cover basic expenses. The prosecutor hesitated. Perhaps to avoid detection, Your Honor. A reasonable argument, but the judge didn't seem convinced. Or, he said quietly, perhaps because that's all she needed. That was the moment everything changed. Not the verdict. Not yet. But the direction. Because now, the case wasn't just about whether she took money. It was about why, and whether that why mattered. Margaret stood there, unmoving. But something in her posture had shifted. Not confidence, but the faintest trace of relief, as if for the first time someone was actually seeing the full picture. The judge leaned back again, silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. Mrs. Ellison, did you attempt to contact the bank or seek clarification about the account? She shook her head. No, I didn't know who to ask. I've never dealt with these things before. My son handled everything. Another layer. Dependence, then sudden responsibility, with no transition, no guidance, just expectation. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, and then something unusual happened. Your Honor, he said, the state acknowledges the defendant's circumstances. However, the law does not differentiate based on emotional hardship. There it was, the line, clear, firm, necessary, but also incomplete. Because laws are designed to guide justice, not replace it. The judge looked at Margaret one last time, not as a defendant, but as a person, and then he spoke, slowly, deliberately. The court recognizes that the defendant did, in fact, withdraw funds without legal authorization. That element is not in dispute. A pause. Margaret's hands tightened again, because this was it, the moment where everything could collapse. However, the judge continued, the court must also consider intent, understanding, and circumstance. The room held its breath. This is not a case of calculated fraud. There is no evidence of concealment, no attempt to exploit, no pattern of excessive gain. Another pause, longer this time. Instead, what we have is a grieving mother, operating without guidance, continuing a pattern of financial behavior she did not fully understand had become unlawful. Margaret's eyes filled, but she didn't cry, not yet. Therefore, the judge said, his voice steady, this court does not find incarceration to be an appropriate or just outcome. A quiet release moved through the room. Not applause, not reaction, just release. The defendant will be required to enter a restitution agreement and complete a financial literacy program. No jail time will be imposed. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not loud, but powerful in its clarity. Margaret finally broke, not with sobs, but with a single quiet exhale that carried months, maybe years, of fear. Thank you, she whispered. The judge nodded once, not as a favor, but as acknowledgement. Because justice, when done right, doesn't feel like mercy. It feels like understanding. And that's what this was. Not a dismissal of the law, but a recognition of the human being standing beneath it. Because sometimes, the difference between a criminal and a mistake isn't what was done. It's what was meant, and whether someone took the time to see it.